Rasti, ujasla dzieci, rasti i cvjetaj, zemljo ravnih ljudi, i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem.
107 years ago, it was the occasion of course, one of the greatest events in human history. That is the October Revolution, or to put it more precisely, the Great Proletarian Revolution that took place, led by the Bolshevik Party in the ruins of the former Tsarist Empire, of course, then currently ruled by the misbegotten collection of petty bourgeois adventurers led by Alexander Kerensky. And this marked a decisive turning point in the whole history of the human race. For the first time ever, and certainly for the first time in a sustainable way, the working class and peasantry, the oppressed classes, the masses in short, had taken power into their own hands and were reshaping one of the largest nations in the world according to their class interests. This was followed, of course, by a howl of rage and call for immediate bloodletting from the international forces of imperialism. The British, the French, the Italians, the Japanese, the United States, all tried to intervene to crush the new Workers' Republic, and all of them failed. They were all defeated, expelled, and had to eventually reach some form of accommodation with the new Soviet government. This is, of course, a significant moment in many respects. Not only did it prove for the first time that the working class can effectively rule and retain state power and build a workers' state, other than, of course, in the very brief experiment known as the Paris Commune that had come over 40 years beforehand. But it also proved decisively that the imperialists, in their attempts to intervene and crush the workers' revolution, could be defeated, and indeed now were doomed to defeat, not just in the colonial possessions that they had held onto for so many years in order to hyper-exploit them, but also ultimately in their own countries as well. It is the October Revolution which sees not only the rise to power of the workers and peasants in what was to become Soviet Russia, but also sees the slow retreat of the imperialist powers back into their homelands. It has been a slow retreat over the course of a century, but the effect of the October Revolution continues to this day. The imperialists continue to shrink. They have attempted to prolong themselves by rallying in one block behind the leadership of the US, but even that now is turning to dust. So tonight we talk about the October Revolution of 1917, and we look at it through the words of those who were either involved in it or who were inspired by it, because it's important to look at how many liberation struggles were influenced by the October Revolution, or which were made possible by the revolution and its successful building of a state of workers and peasants, led by the proletariat, of course, always in alliance with the peasantry. And if we look at the words of other great revolutionaries of the last century, we can see what kind of impact that this had. Ho Chi Minh, writing in 1960 on the occasion of the 90th anniversary of Lenin's birth, said that, and I quote, "At the time," that is 1917, "I supported the October Revolution only instinctively, not yet grasping its historic importance. I loved and admired Lenin because he was a great patriot who liberated his compatriots. Until then, I had read none of his books." So just to pause there and look at what Ho Chi Minh is reflecting on there. As he says at the very beginning of this piece of writing, at the time he's living in Paris, an exile, a man who roved around the world working as various different things, including as a merchant seaman. He was, as he says, living in Paris, retouching photographs and also painting Chinese antiquities. He says in brackets, made in France. And he joined the French Socialist Party in 1917 and rapidly found himself to be a communist. But it's interesting to hear his reflection on why he instinctively supported the October Revolution. He understood it as the Bolsheviks liberating Russia from the chains of colonialism from the chains of its own ruling class and from the chains also imposed upon it by imperialism, principally by the French and by the British. The Germans were in there as well, of course, prior to World War One. And it's worth just pausing for a moment to reflect upon what the Tsarist Empire was. Now, of course, I know very well that it's not the Tsarist Empire technically that gets overthrown in the October Revolution. It's the bourgeois republic that follows along from it. But given how much revisionist history gets printed these days, and how some inside Russia, indeed some inside the Russian power structure, have been engaging in what I can only describe as historical fictions about Tsarism regarding its capability in developing the nation, it is worth just repeating how bad the Tsarist regime was. It disintegrated under the pressures of the war, principally with Tsarist Germany. But it disintegrated for a specific reason, and that reason is that it was wholly unable to develop the country in a sufficient manner to bear up under the strains that the war placed upon it. All of its crucial elements fell to pieces under the strain of war. The food supply system fell to bits. The industrial system couldn't keep up with the demands of the army and the civilian economy. The very thing that started the February Revolution, which saw the Tsar forced out by the Russian bourgeois, was a bread riot. A bread riot started by women workers because they literally couldn't get any bread. The rationing system had fallen to pieces. So Tsarist Russia, whilst being a junior partner in the imperialist coalition with the French and the British, and having imperialist ambitions, certainly towards the breaking up of the decaying and falling Ottoman Empire, was itself being subjected to a greater degree of control by the imperialists, by the French, by the British, and to a certain extent by the Germans, via their investments of finance capital inside Russia itself. And the control that this gave the imperialists, but again, principally the British and the French, over the Russian bourgeois was immense. It is the reason why Kerensky, even if he had wished it, could not have pulled out of World War One. Their so-called partners in the imperialists would not have tolerated that. And given how much control they had over Russian industry and banking, they basically controlled the Russian bourgeoisie. So the Russian bourgeois are both enthusiastic junior imperialists, whilst being partially controlled in what would later become known as a neo-colonial fashion themselves. It's a very odd combination of things, which made Tsarist Russia rather unique. But it meant that the country, whilst having some areas of high development, some areas of development of industry, was utterly incapable of fighting the kind of war that the German imperialists waged upon them, as a consequence of which they threw away the lives of millions and millions of Russian soldiers in return for gaining absolutely nothing. And so the Russian Empire under the Tsar disintegrated. It was replaced by the bourgeois democratic republic, which itself proved unequal to the task. It proved itself unequal to the task of freeing Russia from the domination of the imperialist powers, because the bourgeoisie proved unequal to the task. And the other socialists proved unequal to the task, because their whole rationale was that they were going to allow the development of capitalism in Russia under the leadership of the Russian bourgeois. And the Russian bourgeois are owned and controlled by the British and the French. And so you see how impossible a position it was that the Russian bourgeois democratic republic found itself in. It could not go forward. It could not go forward because the very class forces that it served refused to let it, because it would made no sense to carry on the war from a Russian perspective. It made no sense other than for the bourgeois to try and grab land off the decaying Ottoman Empire, which was really in free fall by then, or, and this was the bigger motivation, to use Russians to act as bullet stoppers for the French and the British, and to a certain extent the United States as well. That's why they wanted to keep the Russians in the war, to keep a large number of German troops occupied in the east. This is why they were desperate for the war to continue in the east. And if that sounds very familiar, that's exactly what they're doing with Ukrainians now. And they own the Ukrainian bourgeois, as we've argued before many times in this program, to an even greater extent than they owned the Russian bourgeois in 1917. And that is where we come back to Ho Chi Minh's comment. The Bolsheviks liberated Russia from the rule of the bourgeois and foreign domination. And that is why it inspired people like Ho Chi Minh, people like Mao Zedong, people like Fidel Castro later on. So we go on into later in Ho Chi Minh's article here, and he says that his outlook was changed radically by Lenin's thesis on the national and colonial questions. And later on, towards the end of this particular article, he says, "At first, patriotism and not communism led me to have confidence in Lenin, in the Third International. Step by step along the struggle by studying Marxism-Leninism, parallel with the participation in practical activities, I gradually came upon the fact that only socialism and communism can liberate the oppressed nations and the working people throughout the world from slavery." And that is, of course, an excellent summary of where Ho Chi Minh and the other Vietnamese leaders came from. They wanted to free their nation from the slavery imposed upon it by French colonialism, but they only found the proper way to do so when they developed fully as Marxist-Leninists. And they realized that the only way to do it was to, of course, not only chase out the French, but also to chase out the compradors, who had been collaborating with French and later American imperialism. And that, of course, was a struggle that took them really from the 1920s, when in its earliest beginnings in Vietnam, all the way through to the middle of the 1970s. So this is a 50-year-long struggle against the French, against the Japanese, against the French again, then against the US imperialists and the South Vietnamese compradors. It's a 50-year fight to win the liberation of Vietnam. It's a fight that, unfortunately, the great Ho Chi Minh didn't live to see the end of. But it's always worth bearing that in mind, just how long it took the Vietnamese to win their freedom, longer than almost any other revolutionary struggle in the last century. So Ho Chi Minh very clear on what led them to victory, as was Nguyen Giap, the senior military commander of the revolutionary forces, who only died just a few years ago at the age of 100. So the other great reflection on this, of course, in terms of the liberation, the great masses in the colonized nations, comes, of course, from Stalin himself, who was, of course, an active participant in the revolution and the war to defend the revolution. Now, Stalin, in a work which looked at the significance of the revolution, and this is called The October Revolution and the National Question, the worldwide significance of the October Revolution, and this is from Stalin's collected works. Stalin argued the following: "The great worldwide significance of the October Revolution chiefly consists in the fact that it has widened the scope of the national question, converted it from the particular question of combating national oppression in Europe into the general question of emancipating the oppressed peoples, colonies and semi-colonies from imperialism. It has opened up wide possibilities for their emancipation and the right paths towards it, has thereby greatly facilitated the cause of the emancipation of the oppressed peoples of the West and the East, and has drawn them into the common current of the victorious struggle against imperialism. It has thereby erected a bridge between the socialist West and the enslaved East, having created a new front of revolutions against world imperialism, extending the proletarians of the West through the Russian Revolution to the oppressed peoples of the East." And this is a point that Stalin made on a number of occasions, which is one that we continue to make today, which is that the greatest allies of the proletariat in the West, which is seeking to free itself from the power of their own ruling classes, are the oppressed peoples of the East. And of course, the ruling classes in the West and their compradors in the East will spend an awful lot of time telling you that this is not possible. And this is potentially even more true in the West, that they tell you over and over again that your best bet as a worker in the Western world is to join with the chauvinists, join in with the chauvinism, join with the imperialists, and join their struggle to subjugate the oppressed peoples of the world. And maybe, just as Cecil Rhodes promised, you'll get some of the loot if you beg hard enough. Well, think of what you could get if you joined with the oppressed peoples of the world. If we joined with those struggling for freedom in West Asia, if we joined with those struggling for freedom in the Sahel, if we joined with those struggling in their fight for socialism in Venezuela and Nicaragua, well, we could achieve that most precious of things of all, which is the removal of the current ruling class from power. That is, in our case, the British ruling class or the American ruling class, who not only subjugate so many peoples across the world for the purposes of hyper exploitation and super profiteering, but also continually and relentlessly immiserate the working class here at home. And this is, of course, a lesson that the bourgeoisie do not want you to remember. And perhaps this is why Stalin is demonized over almost every single other revolutionary leader in the 20th century, because he clearly and concisely pointed this out. Now, Chairman Mao, another great leader from the last century, was, of course, another who, prior to the October Revolution of 1917, had been something of an anarchist, something of a nationalist, and was looking to European thought to guide the Chinese Revolution, as did a lot of Chinese nationalists who were originally in the Kuomintang when it was run by Sun Yat-sen, along with many other revolutionary nationalists of that pre-1917 era. They looked to a lot of Western European, Northern American, and Enlightenment thought to guide their actions. But of course, this changed fundamentally with the October Revolution. Suddenly, there was an example from the far east of Europe, in a country which bordered China, that the Chinese revolutionaries could find inspiration within. And Mao said the following in this work from 1948, which is entitled "Revolutionary Forces of the World Unite Against Imperialist Aggression." And this was from November of 1948. Mao said the following: "The radiance of the October Revolution shines upon us. The long-suffering Chinese people must win their liberation, and they firmly believe they can. Always isolated in the past, China's revolutionary struggle no longer feels isolated, says the victory of the October Revolution. We enjoy the support of the communist parties and the working class of the world. The point was understood by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, forerunner of the Chinese Revolution, who established the policy of alliance with the Soviet Union against imperialism. On his deathbed, he wrote a letter to the Soviet Union as part of his testament. It is the Chiang Kai-shek bandit gang of the Kuomintang that is betraying Sun Yat-sen's policy, standing on the side of the imperialist counter-revolutionary front and opposing the people of their own country. But before long, people will witness the complete destruction of the whole reactionary regime of the Kuomintang by the Chinese people. Chinese people are brave, so is the Communist Party of China, and they are determined to liberate all China." Now, Mao, of course, there mentions two very important things. First of all, the inspiration that the Chinese gained from the October Revolution, but also that Sun Yat-sen was actively pursuing a partnership with the Soviet Union until the very end of his life. In fact, as Mao says, that was in his last will and testament. That's what he wished the Kuomintang to continue to do. But of course, Chiang Kai-shek eventually merely became a puppet of imperialism. First of all, he was a rabid anti-communist, and there's only really one place that a rabid anti-communist ends up in these kind of struggles, and that's as either a fascist or a tool of imperialism, mainly though both. And this is where Chiang Kai-shek, of course, ended up setting up a tyranny on Taiwan, which lasts as an American protectorate to this day. Now, the earth-shattering blow that was the Chinese Revolution is, of course, something which puts it almost on a par with the October Revolution itself, were it not for the fact that, as Mao would acknowledge, without the October Revolution, there would have been really no Chinese Revolution, so not in the same way. But it represented another huge blow to imperialism. To have the Chinese escape out from under the boot of Euro-American imperialism was a huge defeat for the British, the French, and the United States, and one that they still really haven't got over. And from there, we turn to look at another great revolutionary of the 20th century, Fidel Castro, who, in an interview given to Soviet television on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of the October Revolution in November 1977, said the following when it comes to the impact of the revolution. He was asked a question by a Soviet TV reporter who said, "Comandante, I would like to ask you your opinion on the influence of the Great October Revolution." And Castro answered in the following way: "The October Revolution had an impact on the entire world, on all continents, on all peoples. And of course, it has a great influence on Cuba. A few years had elapsed since the end of our wars of independence. But Cuba's wars of independence had not concluded with full independence for our people, because US intervention took place. And as a result, a puppet regime emerged and neo-colonialism was established. The North American monopolies seized our fundamental resources. As a result of that, there was great frustration, great unhappiness among our people. By then, the ideas of Marx and Engels had already been disseminated in some labor and intellectual circles of our country. So the October Revolution had a great impact on our people. We can say that the immense majority of our workers, peasants, and intellectuals welcomed it with great sympathy and experienced a profound solidarity with the October Revolution. This caused the awakening of a much greater interest due to social problems, increased the class struggle, and the study of textbooks by Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and gave a great impetus to the formation of the first Communist Party in Cuba." Castro goes on to say, later on in the interview, "I must add that without the October Revolution, it would have been absolutely impossible to carry out the Cuban Revolution some 42 years later, because the October Revolution precisely created the conditions and the historical circumstances and the correlation of forces that made the Cuban Revolution possible. In other words, the process initiated by the October Revolution and which continued with the building of the first socialist state in the world, the 1,000 times heroic struggle of the Soviet people against the imperialist aggressors and against fascist aggression, precisely created the conditions which made the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959 possible." So another great revolutionary being absolutely clear as to the influence of the October Revolution. And it is these two factors that make the October Revolution the target of fear and opprobrium from the ruling classes of the West to this day. And it is interesting that the attitude towards the October Revolution, even in the Russian government circles, has been evolving into a more positive one since the start of the Russian special military operation. We all must recall that the very beginning of the Russian special military operation began with a long speech from President Putin in which he outlined what he saw as the history of Ukraine. And this included a long, and I would have to say, unfortunately, typical diatribe regarding the role of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in setting up the USSR to allow the secession from it, should a constituent republic be in favor of such a move. Now, I've discussed here at great length why I think that view is wrong. The best thing to view on that on our channel is the discussion I had with Comrade Slava, now of the American Communist Party, back just after Putin gave the interview to Tucker Carlson recently, earlier this year, in fact. And it is interesting to see that 2.5 years in to the special military operation, what do we see? We see that the references to the October Revolution coming from Putin himself have grown more positive. Still not entirely positive. Lenin's mausoleum is still covered on the celebrations of Victory Day. But in his speech to the Valdai Club just yesterday, Putin was saying he was putting the Russian Revolution on the same level as we said there was the English Revolution and the Dutch Revolution. in modernizing the country, which is a bit of a change from some of the things he said in the past. And as the special military operation has gone on, and as the rabid hostility of the imperialists has become clear, the point of view put forward by the Russian Communist Party of the Russian Federation, has gained more traction, it would seem, within the masses of Russia. That the Great October Revolution was the liberation of Russia from not only the backwardness of Tsardom, but also the domination of the imperialists. And as the imperialists seek to re-establish their domination over Russia, it is only natural that those who are sincere Russian patriots, rather than the cardboard patriots that of the bourgeois who flock to the faded and rotting memories of Tsardom, that the sincere Russian patriots go back to the legacy of the October Revolution again and embrace that legacy in a way that is truly progressive. Now, the other part of this, and this is where we will end our initial comments for this evening, is, of course, to go back to that point about the rule of the masses, about the rule of the proletariat in alliance with the peasantry in Russia. And what the October Revolution proved was that not only was it the case that the Tsardom could go, as it had already crumbled, but also the rule of the bourgeois was not inevitable. It was not inevitable that one minority ruling class in the form of the feudalists was going to be replaced by another minority ruling class in the form of the capitalists, that both of these forces could be defeated and chased out of power, that a state could be established which was not only tailored to the class needs of the proletariat and the peasantry, but also it would be one that they would run themselves, and it would be concerned with the building of workers' rule, which is what started to be built in the Soviet Union. This process was diverted, diluted, and ultimately received a huge setback with the counter-revolution of the 1980s. But what that initial period proved, what the period of the 5-year plans proved, was that when the masses not only establish their rule, but know that they rule, they know that the revolution is theirs, that the country is now being shaped by their labor for their benefit and for the benefit of their children and grandchildren. There is no act of heroism that the masses cannot accomplish when they are united together around that very simple truth, that the nation is now theirs, that the responsibility for steering it into a successful future is now theirs, that it is their collective efforts that will decide the future of the nation, and it is their collective labor that will make the nation into something truly wondrous. And if we think of the difference that a mere 40 years made, which is that in 1917, Russia was one of the most backward countries in Europe. And in the 1950s, shortly after the death of Stalin, Russia had gone from being a nation still using wooden plows to a nation that had split the atom and was sending the first artificial satellite into orbit around the Earth. That is the testament to the achievements of the socialist system, to the achievements of workers' rule, to the achievements of the mass mobilization of those workers and those peasants in fighting for socialism, in carrying through a revolution that didn't just last through 1917, didn't just last until 1921 and the defeat of the armies of imperialist intervention. It was a revolution that unfolded relentlessly up until 1941, when eventually the armies of European reaction, led by the Nazis, arrived to try and destroy the revolution and failed to do so, but were only defeated and destroyed themselves, condemning European imperialism to now exist only at the whim and at the beck and call of US imperialism in that historic and dramatic defeat. And the ability of the Soviet masses to bear up under the enormous sacrifices that the murderous rampage of the Hitlerites and their followers inflicted upon the Soviet Union. The ability of the great masses of the Soviet Union to bear those sacrifices and to come through the other side victorious is a testament to the fact that those masses knew that they were building a country which would be of, by, and for them, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln. And that is the lesson, the immortal lesson of October. Not only did it unleash a wave of wars of liberation all the way across the world that is still going on to this day, but it proved that the ability of the masses to become masters of their own destiny, a lesson which can never be erased, no matter how much garbage the bourgeois and their high-ed hacks try to pour all over it. To quote Stalin with reference to his own legacy, the winds of history will blow these away. And as we enter into a time again of revolutions, the winds of history are blowing very strongly now, comrades. And on this day, we give a red salute to the legacy of the immortal October Revolution.
Nad twoim ludzi ma blada, mil tvom rudaru i tvom rataru, mir graditelju i tvom čuvaru, mir tvojoj sreći vodi